Good morning. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Jack McDougall, President and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. You know, for several months now, we've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, likely the biggest economic and public health crisis any of us have ever seen. And then the tragic murder of George Floyd ignited an explosion of anger at ongoing racial inequity and injustice. So needless to say, communities across our region they're hurt, disoriented, and fractured. We have a lot to discuss across our region, and we really need to focus on solutions. While we can't cover everything today, against this backdrop, we are going to talk about the region's hospitality industry, which is right in the middle of everything that's going on. So as you know, hospitality is critical to the region's economy. Every year, we host millions of visitors who come to see the sights, attend conferences, and do business. Our hotels and conference centers make that possible, and our restaurants make visiting and living here great. You know, many restaurants and other businesses are struggling and many won't survive. Others are adapting to serve customers while slowing the spread of COVID-19. And still so many others are showing support and solidarity for today's social justice movement. We're going to hear these stories and explore what the road ahead looks like for this critical industry. We're really fortunate to have as our guests today, Elliott Ferguson, President and CEO of Destination DC, Kathy Hollinger, President and CEO of the Restaurant Association of Metropolitan Washington, Jorge Perez, President and Chief Operating Officer, Regional Portfolio Properties for MGM Resorts International. And our moderator today is Jay Coldren, Managing Director, Eat and Drink at Streetsense. Just really quickly, Jay coordinates activities of a team of really talented experts on projects that include concept visioning and development, operational analysis and oversight, and full concept implementation. He spent more than 30 years in the restaurant and hospitality sector and has served as the managing director for Dean & DeLuca, global brand leader for Edition Hotels, VP of lifestyle brands for Marriott International, among so many other things. So during the discussion today, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will record this session and share it on our website later this week. And now I'll turn it over to Jay to share some brief remarks just to set the stage, introduce today's guests, and then get into our conversation. So with that, I want to thank our guests again, and Jay, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you to the Greater Washington Board of Trade for inviting us to this very timely discussion. We have an amazing panel today, and I'm excited to be here and excited to be talking about these solutions and things that we can do to help the hospitality and food service industries through this amazing time. You know, there's a Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. And it's pretty clear that right now we're in interesting times. We've got a global pandemic that has all but put a halt to the hospitality and the food service industry. And despite that gigantic, enormous wave of business interruption, we're also experiencing an unprecedented movement with the Black Lives Matter protests and the incredible work and the incredible light that's shining on racial injustice throughout the United States and really around the world. So we'll definitely talk to our panelists about this and many other topics, but the tenor of this conversation, as Jack mentioned, is really around the hospitality industry and what the effect of COVID-19 and the coronavirus is on the hospitality industry and ways that we can think about it and ways that we can move forward in this global pandemic. And so what I wanted to share today to set the stage is a couple of stats about the industry and where we are right now, and then dive right into our panelists. For the hotel industry, since the beginning of the crisis, U.S. hotels have lost about $31 billion in revenue. That's about $400 million a day. As of June 3rd, nearly 6 out of 10 hotel rooms were empty. Industry experts predict that there will be about a 57.5% loss of revenue for this year. 7.7 million hospitality and leisure jobs were lost in April, and about 70% of hotel employees have been laid off or furloughed. That's $2.4 billion in lost wages per week. If it's at all possible, the restaurant industry is in the same bucket and slightly worse in many sectors. The National Restaurant Association has predicted that the food service industry lost more than $80 billion by the end of April and is predicted to lose about $240 billion by the end of 2020. 8 million restaurant employees are laid off or furloughed, and thousands of businesses across the U.S. are facing bankruptcy from the loss of revenue and the social distancing measures put in place. It's a very challenging time for the industry. There is a silver lining, and there is little glimmers of hope that we're seeing. There has been about 6 weeks of slightly increased occupancy across the hotel industry. Restaurants are beginning the phase 1 of opening with pretty serious social distancing measures put in place. And we're beginning to see a reemergence of this industry and back to work. So that's the backdrop for this conversation, and it's the backdrop for these panelists to hash out on this call today. And I want to introduce a very talented group of people here, starting with Kathy Hollinger. Kathy is the president and CEO of the Restaurant Association of Metropolitan Washington. She represents over 1,000 restaurants in the region and one of the most vibrant and visible regions in the United States. Since 2012, her visionary leadership has led the organization through its most dramatic period of sustained growth and innovation. She's also raised the profile of the association across the region and nationally. She's an incredible resource and advocate for the food service industry, and we are absolutely delighted to have her. Also joining us today is Elliott Ferguson. Elliott serves as the president and CEO of Destination DC, the official destination marketing organization for Washington, DC. He's a 30-year veteran of the travel and hospitality industry, and he leads Destinations DC's efforts to generate economic opportunity for the district through meetings and tourism, overseeing the organization's convention and tourism sales, marketing, finance, and business development operations. He began his tenure with Destination DC in December 2001, which is 19 years ago, and has served as the president and CEO since 2009. We are honored and delighted to have him with us today. Elliott, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jake.
Last but certainly not least is Jorge Perez. Jorge is the president and COO of MGM Resorts regional portfolio, where he oversees the company's 8 U.S. properties outside of Las Vegas, including destinations in Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Mississippi, all the M's, New Jersey, New York, and Ohio. He also serves as the president and COO of the MGM National Harbor, where he manages the day-to-day operations of this beautiful resort. He's an industry veteran with 25 years of experience in the hospitality industry. He began his career in 1995 as a member of the accounting team at the Treasure Island Resort and Casino. And Jorge has also worked in various finance and accounting management roles at several Las Vegas properties, including the Mirage, Bellagio Hotel and Casino, and City Center, and spent 7 years at the beautiful Beau Rivage Resort and Casino in Biloxi, Mississippi. Jorge, thanks so much for being here. We're very happy to have you as well.
Glad to be here, Jay. Thank you.
Diving right into the brilliant minds of our panel, as Jack mentioned in his opening remarks, the hospitality industry is really facing 2 major challenges right now. One, to keep our guests and customers safe from COVID-19, and then also to show support and solidarity for Black Americans and others pushing for racial equality and justice right now. We'll get into the COVID-19 situation in a moment, but first I'd like to ask each of the panelists to speak to how your organizations and partner businesses have responded to the protests, and what are your near-term thoughts and priorities as in light of the Black Lives Matter movement? So Elliott, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to start with you.
Sure, Jay. Happy to give some insight. You know, as you can imagine, what's happening in America and what's happening in Washington is really resonating with me and the community that I live in and the community that I serve, which is hospitality, and is very diverse. You know, watching the protests in the city, you know, doing some self-reflection in terms of what it means to me, circumstances and times where I was stopped by the police, and fortunately I, you know, just one step removed from being, you know, in a similar situation to Mr. Floyd. In my opinion, things could go south really quickly if you're Black in America. So I think the reality for me, as I do my self-reflection, see what's happening in the city, is I put it all in perspective. You know, I appreciate the protests that are happening in the city. You know, we are a city that's known for people coming and exercising the First Amendment, and we enjoy that opportunity in this country, and it happens in DC all the time. You know, there are components of it that I don't necessarily agree with, but you know, I understand the anger. I understand the sentiment of those that are coming into the city that are protesting. That is, quite frankly, a rainbow coalition of America, mostly millennials and Generation Z, who are truly getting it. You know, my priority for my team is to continue to open up dialogue so that we can have these painful conversations about what it's like to be Black in America, which will then extend to other communities that may also have things to share. So, you know, I'm proud to be in Washington, D.C. during this moment. I'm proud as to what our mayor has done and how she has pushed back and made this a priority for the city.
Great. Elliott, thank you very much for that. Kathy, I know that a lot of your partner businesses and restaurants are really in the middle of these protests and really supporting them in a variety of different ways. How are you seeing that that happen with the restaurants in the region?
Yeah, so what we saw, especially this past weekend, were hundreds of restaurants, more than hundreds, scores across the region, but you would see it much more visibly downtown, where they were operators, owners, employees, they were right there standing with, in solidarity with the protesters. They also found a way to play a role as a restaurant in feeding, hydrating, providing shelter for protesters. You know, the last several months, I am astounded by the resiliency of this industry. And they are constantly thinking in a purpose-driven manner around what role they can play, but particularly over the last week. And then, you know, to Elliott's point, as an organization, you know, the last few years have been very deliberate about how we are ensuring that our community of members within our industry are reflective of what we see in our community, and to make sure that we are incredibly inclusive, but also organizationally inward, to really think about being bold and deliberate around who is a part of our board, how we are reflecting the community within our board. And I'll tell you, Jay, I think right now, as we are all very pensive, we are pausing, we are listening, we have to do better. We have to do better as organizational leaders. We have to be bold, and we have to be unforgiving in that manner. We have to really think about the changes that we may need to make as we are taking steps forward, because the healing is immense in terms of need, and it's going to really take all of us as leaders of organizations to come together and be bold in our actions.
That's great. Very well said. Thank you, Kathy. Jorge, you represent properties all throughout the U.S. and in many different regions and many different socioeconomic makeups. What are you seeing as MGM is facing this in a variety of different markets?
Yeah, and you know, obviously it varies. The severity of the reaction, if you will, does vary by market. But Kathy, to your point, as far as responsibility, I can tell you personally, for me, you know, being with MGM 25 years, we developed a diversity and inclusion program 20 years ago. And I was fortunate to be a part of that group that initially established this for our company. As you know, as large organizations, it's up to us, and small organizations. It doesn't matter what size. It needs to be a part of your core DNA. I can tell you, with regard to my organization, it is a part of our core values. Most of our employees are diverse and from diverse backgrounds, and so are many of our customers, right? So we've got to understand their sensitivities, hear their story, be able to talk to them the appropriate way. And I tell you, for me personally, being a Hispanic male, I was born in Puerto Rico, and I was young when I came to the States. Elliott, I couldn't be in your shoes, but I do sympathize with the African-American community. You know, I too went through that, primarily in my early years in the US. But you know, as an organization, beyond just line employees, management, right? We have guidelines, specific guidelines, when we interview, particularly for management, director, executive positions, where we need to have diverse pool. And that's where you make a change, right? You've got to have leaders that appropriately represent your community and your employee base.
That's great. Thank you, Jorge. Very important conversation to have. Kathy, if I could jump into the COVID response for the restaurant industry for a moment. You know, now that restaurants are beginning to open back in a somewhat limited way, How are you see them deal with these social distancing guidelines, and what are the big challenges that the restaurant industries are facing during this global pandemic?
So, right now we are mostly across the region, we are mostly outdoor dining that is permitted. And in DC, it's a little bit different than in Northern Virginia, for example, who has a capacity of 50% outside. But I will say this on the whole, they're doing remarkably well in considering what they need to do to reopen. I mean, it is a lot to manage and consider in terms of practices, operations, but again, starting in March, if not before, with groups like Think Food Group, Clyde's Restaurant Group, they were thinking about many things pre-COVID-19 to really consider what needs to change to ensure that the operation is positioned successfully, the guests would be safe, that their employees are safe. I would say that the biggest challenge right now is some of the inconsistency in guidelines. For example, when an employee tests positive for COVID-19 and what needs to be done without fully disrupting an operation, recognizing that you may need to disrupt the operation,
Right.
but understanding who needs to be extracted from the restaurant, who needs to be tested, and knowing that many different guidelines are out there with local Department of Health organizations. They sometimes take it on case by case. And I would say that daily in the communication that I get from operators, it's usually a nuanced question around how an operator or establishment deals with and walks through the protocol of someone testing COVID positive.
Yeah. Jorge, are you seeing the same thing at MGM, or have you not sort of rested over that yet?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously this pandemic is extremely serious. We lost, 13 employees. And as recently as last week, we had an employee pass away. And we opened 2 properties in Mississippi a week and a half ago. Within the first week, we had an employee that was active that tested positive. One of the things that I was going to talk about is just make sure, and I can get in a little more detail, you have to have a plan. But in this specific instance, right, there are specific protocols, and it's pretty straightforward, right? Either you're contacting your management and HR personnel, making sure the employee immediately goes and gets, tested. If in the event that they do have symptoms, in the case where it does come back positive, contact tracing is extremely important. So identifying quickly who that employee was working in close proximity with, especially in close quarters or for a long period of time, and sending those employees to immediately get tested. Obviously, we have a large organization, easier for us to manage through that versus a small operator. Because unfortunately, if you have to shut your doors because you are, you're just a local shop, if you will, it could be pretty devastating for you. But look, it's sending, the contact tracing, getting employees tested, sanitizing the space immediately, and then having good, solid speaking points for your employees to set them at ease.
Yeah. So Elliott, there's a lot of fear out there in the market, and a lot of businesses in DC just wouldn't exist without the influx of visitors that are coming from around the world. And how is Destination DC thinking about bringing visitors back into the market? Do you think it'll be a different place that they'll come from in the near term? And then how do you build confidence in DC as a safe and desirable destination again?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you really pay attention to the trends that we've all had to deal with over the years, you mentioned earlier, Jay, I moved here in December 2001, just a few months after 9/11. It took us 10 years to rebound in terms of the leisure market, coming back to the US, coming back to DC. Over the last 10 years, we've seen record numbers of visitors, and we were happy with the numbers of visitors and the economic impact that we had in Washington last year. Where we are now, this is 9 times, the economic impact is 9 times worse than the economic impact of 9/11 on all of our economies. For a city like Washington, we're nearly $2 billion behind where we should be in terms of visitation and the revenue generated. So, at the end of the day, our organization is an economic development organization. The difference is we want people to come for 3 to 5 days, eat in our restaurants, go to Jorge's, and to MGM, and then get the heck out of town and invite other people into the city. So when that doesn't happen, we also employ 79,000 people. So, we went from a reactionary mode of, I can't believe that this is happening, this is unprecedented, to okay, now how do we get back on track? Which is kind of what you're asking me now. And the first step for us is to look at the markets in which we think will rebound fastest. We know that there are about 50 million people that live within a 250-mile driving radius of Washington. And we're going to focus on that market because consumer confidence is going to be inconsistent. A lot of people won't be comfortable getting on an airplane. A lot of folks will be uncomfortable and not know exactly whether or not, whether they're safe coming into Washington or any city in the US or the world. So things that MGM, hotels in Washington, DC, and others are doing to ensure safety are extremely important. I know that the restaurant industry, the theater industry, the sporting industry, everyone is looking at guidelines that are going to be very important to make sure that consumers, as they're coming back to our destination, know what they can and cannot do. And then, of course, there are going to be expectations on those consumers. So it won't be business as usual, but we do know that tourism and hospitality tends to rebound faster from an economic perspective. We're already seeing the inquiries about coming back to the city. The problem that we have right now is that, there's some limited things in which you can do in a restaurant. Theater and all the other things, sporting events and things like that are not an option. The museums are closed, so you're relegated to outdoor activities, which is nice in Washington, D.C., and of course, monuments and memorials. So it's all tied to the stages of reopening, but right now, most of our efforts will be focusing on that drive-in market. And we're not doing it yet. It's too premature, but we hope to have something in place in the next 30 plus days or so, specifically focusing on that market. The meetings market, there will be some rebounding a little faster, not the citywides, because they simply can't meet based on guidelines. And we're going to rely very heavily on some of those smaller meetings. And there's already a demand. We're all sick and tired of Zoom meetings and Zoom calls, and we want to get back to face-to-face as soon as possible. And we're going to be there for that market.
Yeah. Jorge, I know that MGM is heavily dependent on a lot of the group business in some of your larger properties. How are you dealing with this, and what are you seeing come back right now? And then I'd love to bring Kathy into this discussion too.
Yep, no, perfect. And I'll talk about, obviously the MICE business is a lot more relevant to Las Vegas, and I deal with those teams extensively. It was the first line of business that reacted to the pandemic, and to be specific, the IT sector, those groups canceled first. As a company, you can make a decision and push back and enforce your cancellation fees and do that sort of thing, or you partner with these organizations. The MICE business, as you guys know, is all about relationships, and that's the approach that we took. So understood, we canceled hundreds of millions of dollars worth of business for 2020, and incentivized these organizations to rebook either later in the year. I would say most of them rebooked starting in 2021. But again, just having that open and candid conversation with those companies to rebook and remain guests. What we're seeing is Elliott, to your point, there's absolutely interest. We still have tens of thousands of room nights, if not more, for the remainder of 2020. What I see is, I think some of that business is really going to start picking up in the latter part of Q3 and escalate in the fourth quarter. December for Las Vegas is typically pretty soft with regard to especially citywides. And we did get an announcement just recently that CES, which is the Consumer Electronics Show, big citywide, has confirmed that they will meet in January of next year, of 21. So there is some optimism, but in that line of business, it's going to take some time to recover.
Yeah. Kathy, how now that we sort of understand better the way that we're sort of coming out of the pandemic, what are the restaurants doing in the community? And, I think some of the larger, chains and things have enough capital to survive this, but what are the individual restaurants and the neighborhood restaurants doing, to really survive the next 12 to 24 months in light of this rebound?
Yeah, so I would say that all of them are being incredibly creative and innovative because they have to be. What we saw initially in March and April was this pivot to how can I do carry out and take out really, really well and delivery. Knowing that candidly, that is going to be a big part of everyone's operation, very likely in all capacities. I mean, even in terms of the programming that we provide for our community around Restaurant Week, Cocktail Week, what does it look like to have an on-premise experience, but how can you have that same experience at home? And restaurants have been fantastic in how they have been doing that. We've seen restaurants turn their floor plan and footprints into markets. We've seen operators focused on worker relief or first responders or frontline employees during the crisis. They have thought of everything. The question is, there is a period of time where that pivot was around purpose. But as we go through this process over 12 months of recovery, it is also how can they sustain as an operation in diversifying the revenue coming in, thinking about the products that they are pushing out, whether it's takeout, delivery, working with our elected officials, which there has absolutely been a willingness to do that with short-term relief. But some of that short-term relief needs to be extended at a minimum for 12 months, if not candidly, permanently, with the sale of alcohol, beer and wine. I mean, that saved many people. Mm-hmm. And then, it's this notion of we are on this long road to recovery. Operators are going to need relief in different ways. And knowing that we're an industry that consumers want to come back, one of the first things that they say they want to do is go dine out at their favorite restaurant. And as operators are charged with creating a great quality experience, coupled with a very safe and enforceable with guidelines experience, what are our elected officials across the region really doing to support an industry that generates so much revenue to bring them back so they are also winning as well? And we're going to hold our electeds accountable to that because we're the first industry to celebrate, but we get hit the hardest, and we are 96% independently owned and operated. So I'm very hopeful. People are out and they want to be out. They're just out in a way that is currently modest, but it's going to grow. And I think we're going to have, ebb and flow of what works here, but the operators are definitely positioned to think about all creative ways to bring in the revenue they need to sustain what they know is going to be a longer period of time. But we're going to need additional relief to help them through that.
Yeah. And Kathy, what do you think that I know that there's these open streets, DC, and, using the streets. What are the municipalities doing right now that you see that are working in the community?
So Elliott and I talk about this often. So I have lots of thoughts there. I think that I love open streets. I think that it works in certain places better than it does in others. I think for DC, what I know is that as we enter phase 2, there's going to be much more creative use of outdoor space. And we need that. We have to just be mindful that it doesn't create it doesn't create the barriers for the small business operators who are probably going to stay in the takeout and delivery for a minute because financially it doesn't make sense for them to increase their team and increase staff and go to a on-premise dining model. But I think that the city is very, very aware that they need to think outside the box. You know, I had the pleasure of working with Jose Andres during Reopen DC as we co-chaired that subcommittee. And he had brilliant ideas around how that could work. And I know the city's taking that very seriously. Northern Virginia is doing some great stuff right now. I mean, it's parking lots that you drive up, you find your parking space, open up your hatch, they set up a table, and there you are, dining al fresco. It's beautiful. And as the weather remains, knock on wood, more pleasant than not, I think this is a really great way to get our industry back, taking advantage of all we know is very safe in the outside world, literally the outside world, outside space.
Yeah. Elliott, what do you see is working, that you see across the city? What's working for you?
Well, I think that the fact that the city, and I'm not part of DC government, but we, like Kathy, we work closely with DC government. People get the fact that we don't have the luxury of going back to business as usual because it's not an option. And people are being creative. Even with the Reopen DC group, whereas I was on one of the components tied to meetings, and we were very disappointed with when we can have larger meetings. We get it, but we know that there's going to be flexibility within our government based on what's happening in other parts of the US and other parts of the world. And trust me, we're paying attention to what's happening. So, it's been very interesting to, when you ask Kathy about outside dining, restaurants initially said absolutely no, takeout is not going to work. And within 3 weeks, I'm not saying it was the answer because they were still suffering economically, but they were doing takeout. So now the reaction is absolutely you can't shut down the streets. I live on Capitol Hill. I'd love to see 8th Street, Barracks Road turn into an outside dining experience after hours. Can't do it in the summertime. It's too hot during the day. But I think there's going to be flexibility because we all have a desire to get back to normal. We want to go to sporting events. We want to go to concerts and play the slots and do all the things in which our region affords visitors an opportunity to do. Same with museums. We've got to go to a system whereas, because we have 16 free museums that are part of the Smithsonian, and that does not even include the National Gallery of Art or the Holocaust Museum, we've got to make sure that when people are coming, and they will come because that's what we're marketing, that their experience is not tied to standing outside in line for 4 hours because you can't have these buildings back to their normal capacity. So we're working it out. I'm in a lot of subgroups trying to figure out what makes the most sense because bottom line for me is that we want to market the fact that DC has 100 free things to see and do, which will resonate with a lot of people that don't have, that are probably on a financial, have budgetary issues, but they want to get out. They want to get out and get out of the house, and we want to make sure that DC is one of those options. So the ideas continue to swirl, and it's going to be really interesting to see what we find we can do when we're able to reopen, and equally as much what might resonate as something we want to do on a regular basis. Perhaps restaurants will decide 1 week out of every month in a certain period of time that they will close the street and do outside dining on a regular basis. So we'll wait and see what happens as we look at bringing those much needed visitors back to the city.
Right. Jorge, what is your organization? What is MGM looking for these individual municipalities to do? What are the sort of markers you're looking for to support a business like yours in bringing back some of the either sporting events or large group businesses? How are you thinking about it?
Look, at the end of the day, the health and safety of the customers and our employees is paramount. So as long as there's good collaboration and transparency on what we're thinking and what they're thinking and their expectations, that's all we can do at this point in time. I can tell you by, and again, we're just opening our businesses. We opened, in the case of MGM, we opened 3 properties in Las Vegas last week. There is pent-up demand. That is the good news. People want to get out, enjoy themselves, be entertained, have a great meal, and socialize. We just need to do it. It's up to us. We need to do it responsibly. But the demand is there. I was a part of doing some financial modeling 2 months ago. And I can tell you what we were projecting for the first, let's say 30 days of our business versus what we're seeing 2 to 3 times the revenues that we anticipated. So The business is coming back. It's, you know, how sustainable will it be? Time to tell. I think it will be sustainable. The other thing we're seeing is customers are appreciative. They are tipping. Our employees are, the employees that have come back are extremely happy. Customers are reaching in and tipping excessively right now. It's a way to give back. They've known that our industry was hit the hardest, and that is a trend that we're seeing across the board, which is pretty encouraging. But Jay, look, it's a waiting game. Obviously, the different in the 7 states in which I'm operating, I've got 1 state that has 2 casinos where we're operational. We're opening another resort in Ohio next week. To be determined. I get asked every single day, when is MGM National Harbor open? It's when the government allows us. I'm hoping it's before 4th of July weekend, but time to tell.
Yeah. You mentioned the customer and the, keeping them safe and healthy. And I'm curious for the panel, what are your thoughts on what the responsibility of the guests and customers are as we get back to business? Kathy, I know this is a tricky thing. There's a big, spectrum of people who have different views on what should happen and what shouldn't happen and whether they should wear a mask, et cetera. What are your thoughts on this? What's responsible and how should restaurants handle this?
Yes, I mean, as you can imagine, we talked about this at length, and we have conversations with, my counterparts across the country. We talk about this regularly, and the reality is that the responsibility is shared. And it has to be shared. It is a commitment that an operator is making to their guests walking in, and it's a shared responsibility of the guest walking into that restaurant. And there have been discussions, and we included it in our reopen guidance, that should be in the form of not a legal contract at the door, rather a promissory note that comes from the operator, and the same kind of promise that is made to the operator from the diner, that I commit as an operator to operating in this way in accordance with the guidelines from the particular jurisdiction's health department. I commit to all of these things, but you as a diner are committing to not walking into our establishment if you are not feeling well. Wearing a mask to not necessarily just protect yourself, but protect those that may need protecting, and that takes a shared responsibility. So there was a lot of momentum around this promise from the operator and promise from the diner, because it's also a much softer way of ensuring that we are really in this together and we will get through this together, but it absolutely takes on a shared responsibility, as our operators are also not equipped to be police officers running their operation when it's beautiful weather and large crowds are gathering outside to pick up takeout or curbside. It takes a village around reopening.
Yeah. Jorge, how are your staff dealing with this in the other markets that have opened?
Yeah, so let me, so a couple things. Kathy, completely agree with you. This is a shared responsibility, and we're in an industry of bringing people together, right? So it's a little counterintuitive. The first thing is our employees have been out of work for some time. There's a lot of anxiety for them to return to work. So having a plan and taking the time to train your employees and be able to speak to them directly about what's expected is paramount. The other thing I would add is, versus looking at this from an operational perspective as a nuisance, this is a great opportunity to align this with your brand. What I've seen is, at this point, I've been in 7 casino resorts in 3 different states over the last 2 weeks. And what I've seen, my observations are, there is a clear correlation between customer compliance, be it wearing masks or social distancing, with what the company or the property or the business has portrayed from a health and safety standpoint. So between signage, between promoting in your collateral, signaling on your database or on your websites, making sure that your employees are trained and they seem comfortable. When you're in that environment, your customers will react to it. I've been in places, casinos and other restaurants, where there's nothing. It's, you walk in and it's like business as usual, and guess what? And customers are behaving like like nothing ever happened. And that's, to me, that's reckless. And we just need to do a better job as an industry and make sure that we're compliant.
Yeah. Elliott, is there any way to communicate this to people coming into the market? I mean, is there any way to set the expectation prior to people coming?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, the hotels are sharing what the expectation is of visitors or their guests on their websites. We're sharing information as to what the protocol will be tied to coming into Washington, so that, you know, at this point, there should be no one traveling without a mask. But we know that that will happen. You know, and I think that sometimes people forget that 20 years ago, the process of travel changed for us significantly. Whereas we went from taking whatever the heck we wanted to on a plane to taking things that are 3 ounces or less, which sounded absurd, but we adjusted. The process of if you have a ticket, you can go to certain terminals, that was upsetting at the time, but there are generations now that have not known anything else other than that. And if you've traveled internationally, especially in Asia, if you go to Beijing, 90% of the people you see have been wearing masks for years. It's you know, respiratory disease is the #1 killer there. I think that you'll find that we will have to adjust. There are not many options. There will not be an option in some cases to wearing a mask. And it's our responsibility as best we can to make sure that we convey what you can and cannot do, or exactly how you can enjoy Washington. And then we'll make sure that the websites, like I could imagine if someone makes a reservation with MGM, in addition to getting your reservation via email, you're also going to get the protocol or the things that are required of you as a visitor in terms of your safety and making sure that our employees are safe. So it's just going to be yet another change in terms of how we do business, which is important.
Great. So I have one sort of personal question for the panel, if I may, and then we have quite a few questions coming in through the Q&A. But you know, panel, what are you most looking forward to getting back to as these social distancing restrictions are lifted and as the world begins to return to normal? So I'm gonna start with Kathy on this. What are you looking most forward to?
I think it may be similar to what others are, but just the camaraderie and being able to come together as an industry and a community and celebrate milestones and anniversaries and birthdays and eat out at your favorite places. But for the operators, I look forward to the operators being able to do what they do best, and that is exceptional hospitality and welcoming people in the way that they once did into their homes, and diners, extension, living rooms, and so camaraderie.
Yeah. Jorge, how about you? What are you looking forward to?
Look, some normalcy, right? But it's gonna take some time. This is the new normal. There are some benefits to some of the things that we're doing, right? Our places have never been cleaner, right? For what it's worth. But you know, some of this, Elliott, to your point, right? Just like the travel industry had to deal with this 20 years ago, some of this is going to stay in place for some time. I tell you what I also see is the push in technology, right? Not only in our business, but others. And customers have been wanting it for a while. It's just there's always priorities with regard to capital projects. But you know, here I'm very much looking forward to it at National Harbor. You'll no longer need a key. You don't have to go to a front desk to check in. I mean, that's something that we've wanted to do. Everything will be on your mobile phone, right? Just, you know, and we're going to get there. I've seen it. You know, the South obviously was impacted less than the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. Generally, they're reacting a little more reckless than you would like to see. But there is some normalcy coming back, and we will get there. It's just going to take a little time.
Yeah. Elliott, how about you?
Yeah, I think the key thing with me is that, you know, when we think about travel, everyone, you know, Jack's on my board and people have these rosy colored pictures of these trips that I go on and the fact we have offices in all these different countries. And Jorge can tell you that, you know, 6 days in Asia and back and is not a lot of fun. But at the same time, meetings, travel, gives us a chance to celebrate our differences and appreciate our likenesses. And it's the best opportunity for us to learn a lot about things that we don't know about different cultures. And I miss that. I miss the opportunity to actually do what I do, which is travel. My wife's in this industry as well. So the fact that we've been grounded since March is strange to us. But the thing that I enjoy the most when we see the international travelers, which we know it's going to take 18 months or longer before they're able to come back and travel the way they used to. Economically, they stay longer, they spend more, we want them. But at the same time, I appreciate the opportunity for them to learn a lot more about American culture and the differences in each of the cultures that we have. You know, right now, my CFO's in the office. He was raised in South Korea, moved here about 10 years ago. And he talks to his parents. He comes to the office like every once in a while just to get some stuff done. And I'm like, what are your parents saying? What's being said about America and South Korea? And usually when I'm in these cities or countries, they want me to be that spokesperson. I chair the U.S. Travel Association. I represent Washington, D.C. They think that everything happens in Washington, D.C. because we're the nation's capital. And we have to be that brand ambassador for what really is happening versus what they're seeing. And what he said to me in terms of what their perception is that they're concerned about him physically coming to DC and coming into the office. It's not safe. I've seen it. And that is why travel is so important. That's what I miss, the opportunity for them to recognize the fact that America is perhaps more than what they're seeing on TV and vice versa when I travel to those countries. So I know that's a long answer, but that is the thing that I love the most about being in DC with 180 plus embassies and having the opportunity to see people come to our country and vice versa.
That's great. A lot of great questions coming through. I'll throw this out to the panel. Really interesting question. Why are social distancing and reopening standards different for restaurants and bars and retail? Any idea why that is? Kathy, you're nodding.
I'm nodding because it was a question we also had on Reopen DC, but I'll say this, you know, there is the idea that it's the social gathering piece of it. I mean, I will speak to bars and restaurants versus retail. Maybe someone else can take that on. But there was a lot of conversation around what's the difference between getting people together in a bar versus getting people together in a restaurant. And the idea is that it had more to do with the distance between a bartender and someone sitting at a counter bar versus repurposing the space in a bar to dine. And we somewhat landed on this repurposing the space in a bar to be able to be used, but to be used for dining versus a gathering place of people coming together where social distancing may not be able to be practiced. Now, the reality is that there are many operators where their footprint would allow for a social distance gathering at the bar. But the concern from health departments was great. And there was also concern that the smaller establishments who don't have that space, how do we create a guideline that somewhat works for everyone? So we talked about that a lot. I think that we came to some good resolution around making sure that bars are also treated the same way that restaurants are, to allow for them to enter in a phase that restaurants are during reopen. Retail, I will leave that to my other two esteemed panelists.
Gentlemen, any thoughts on that? Or
yeah, I can chime in too. So look, from what we know, right, the virus is transmitted through moisture, either through breathing, coughing, or sneezing, right? So if you're in an environment, i.e. a restaurant or a bar, where typically the time period for transmission is longer, right, versus a retail establishment, I think that's probably the main distinguishing factor between the two. We've spent a tremendous amount of time working through all those logistics as far as how we've laid our floors out, the social distancing aspect, where do you put, either plexi, polycarbonate barriers, and certainly requiring employees to wear masks. Retail for the most part, as long as you control the occupancy, you're probably getting there. It's just a lot more complicated with F&B. It just is. So
that's great. Elliott, this is a good question for you from the Q&A. Can you address any current guidelines in DC for numbers of participants that can gather for meetings or conferences? We're aware of the restaurant regulations, but not meetings. Any thoughts on what's happening there?
Yes. One, we don't like them, but two, we understand them. Basically, the guidelines are tied to gatherings of certain numbers, like at stage 1, 10 people or less, stage 2, 50 people or less, stage 3, 250 people, which really prohibits what we call big boxes, the big hotels, the Marriott Marquis, the Omnis, from really being able to do business, or for us to host any major citywide in the convention center. And for that reason, unlike Jorge, whereas they've hosted their booking business in 2020, or at least 2021, or at least retaining business, we're still losing citywide groups for 2021. These are the guidelines that are in place based on what the reopened DC and the medical community knew at that time. I referenced earlier that they will continue to evaluate that and change them as they learn different things. The question about restaurants versus retail, restaurants, I get a little bit more because you can't eat food with a mask on, you can't drink with a mask, and since there is a sense that you're more susceptible if you're not wearing a mask at a closer distance. But retail, I don't get it, and more than likely that will change. But right now, those stages of opening really prohibit, in a lot of cases, any large gathering of 250 people or more.
It's an interesting question that came across. Thank you for that, Elliott. Thank you. What coordination and conversations have been held with the transportation sector leaders, Amtrak and the airlines, regarding future travel to Washington? Amtrak is a major part of the hospitality network that leads to our region. Are there conversations happening with them?
Yeah, with U.S. Travel Association, we are having conversation and dialogue in terms of what makes the most sense, what is recommended, because as you know, if you're on a Acela train, it's a lot different than if you're on a regular passenger train. But based on the guidelines, they're limited as to how many people can sit within close proximity. Same with airports, same with metropolitan systems in cities like DC and others. So those things are being redefined as we're reopening. There's a fundamental difference now as to them going back into service. We heard the subway system in New York is going to go back to 24 hours, but people are still working from home. So it's not the same as it will be if offices opened up. And even when offices reopen, a large segment of the population will probably still work from home for a variety of reasons. One, because you can't social distance in certain offices at 100%, so perhaps they'll allow 50% of those individuals to work from home. So the guideline, what we're basically saying through U.S. Travel Association is that the guidelines need to be clear, and there needs to be no margin of error in terms of an individual being able to say that, why are there discrepancies, which could easily happen, as we've been seeing in certain parts of reopening in different cities. So it's something that is being evaluated, and we're having conversations as we know and recognize the fact that those are modes of transportation for people coming into the city. At the same time, as we're looking at a drive-in market, which scares me, DC does not have the capacity for a lot of cars. We've told people for years, don't bring your cars. The whole valet system is going to have to change. I don't want someone valet parking my car. So there are a lot of things that are being worked out and discussions being had right now in regards to what this looks like as we reopen.
Yeah. Kathy, one for you. Do you believe that the safety rules and policies should come from a national level or local jurisdiction level, especially when we live in an area with so many local jurisdictions so close? How does it work if there's different policies in place, and even across the country when some states don't require masks by patrons? So DC is tricky, right? You have, restaurant group with, 15 locations in 3 different states. What are your thoughts on that?
So I would say that I think the most beneficial right now is regional. I mean, what we see here in DC, I talk very regularly with my counterpart in Virginia, in Maryland, to really figure out how we are coordinating our recommended efforts. Now, what they actually do as regional leaders is slightly different, but for the most part, we've seen that Northern Virginia has been slightly ahead of us in DC, and we're slightly ahead of Montgomery County and Prince George's County in Maryland. I think it's critical as a region to operate similarly, for guidance to be similar. Northern Virginia, they have more space than we do in DC. So it is interesting that they went to 50% occupancy outdoors in Northern Virginia, yet there's no occupancy in DC. Not complaining about anything in terms of how things landed, but there are of course some hiccups in terms of actual guidance that is being pushed out and implemented. Now, as far as what is happening across the country, we were a part of daily calls with states all across the country around who is doing what when. And there were for sure states that were very much ahead in timeline of how they chose to reopen. But again, they're very different markets, very different footprints. And regionally, that has been, I believe, the most productive and constructive thinking in terms of how we reopen as a business community.
Great.
Kathy, you also have members in Maryland and Virginia, as do I. So
Right.
you also represent the region. So
Right.
So panel, we're actually running sort of toward the end of our time here. I'd love to start with Jorge and hear from all of you. Any final thoughts you have on where we are today and what's next? And again, we only have about 3 minutes before I have to hand it over to Jack. So Jorge, what do you think?
Yeah, so Jay, thanks again, and fellow panelists for having me on. This has been a great and insightful conversation. Look, it's complicated, right? But I think as an industry, I see a lot of very positive things being done. I will share with the smaller operators. Look, these larger corporations did a tremendous amount of work. Hired experts, spent dollars on consultants. That information is available. In our case, mgmresorts.com, we have our 7-point safety plan. Leverage that information. Don't start from scratch, right? These corporations spend, hundreds of thousands of man hours. So leverage the information that's out there. It's important, and then just apply it. I'll just note again, versus looking at this as an operational nuance, embrace it. It can be a part of your brand. Your customers will appreciate it. The customers that I've spoken to for our resorts that have opened, they appreciate it, absolutely appreciate it. And the other item is employees. I can't stress that enough. I will note one thing. We were extremely concerned between unemployment and the CARES Act, which has been great, that many employees wouldn't want to come back to work. That has not been the case at all. Even though we're at least for the properties we've opened, we're probably at about 50% of our employees. In excess of 95% of the employees that we've called have wanted to come back, and they've come back. Great. So I think that's worth noting for the operators as well.
That's great. Thank you, Jorge, and thank you for your time. Elliott, for you, very quickly, your thoughts.
Yeah, very, very optimistic about the future. I think that, again, this is a component of the economy that tends to rebound faster than others, and that's our goal. Unfortunately, unlike Jorge, we have not been able to take advantage of PPP. As a 501c6, we have not been eligible, and that's something that we're working on again with U.S. Travel. But, as well as having a marketing budget to promote our destination, but there's still a lot of optimism as we look at recovery.
Great, thank you so much. And Kathy, for you?
Yeah, real quick, I would say, we are hopeful, and I would 100% agree with Jorge. We tell so many people every day, please don't spend the time or little money that you have reinvesting in a blueprint, in a plan, when there are so many that are willing to share and willing to share what they've put so much time to create in terms of operational guidance, how to rethink models. So for operators, I would state that. And I would also say that, you know, in this time, to anyone outside of our industry, to support our industry. Eat out, order in, send food to someone. There are so many ways that you can support our small businesses. And then finally, in months of not always knowing what to say, I just encourage that people are patient and people are kind during this process, because we're all learning a lot of new things as we reset our businesses.
Kathy, thank you much. Panel, thank you very, very much. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jack for final thoughts.
Well, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Kathy, Elliott, and Jorge, really insightful. Appreciate you spending the time with us today. It's a really important conversation. Jay, thank you for helping us navigate through that. You know, we really do appreciate it. Elliott, I will say, and I think this is the right answer, is that I know all your travel is glamorous and stress-free, and I should encourage everyone to travel. I think that's the right answer, isn't it?
Sure.
Yes, having traveled most of my life, I know better. But anyway, on behalf of Destination DC, as we get things back up and running, I certainly encourage people to travel and spend their time here. It's an extraordinary moment in time. We have a lot of work to do, or we have a lot of conversations to engage in. We have a lot of listening to do. But I think this is our moment. And I do think that we are in a position now, probably better than ever, to really build the kind of future economy and community and society that we want. You know, one that's strong, resilient, and benefits everyone. And so I look forward to continuing this conversation and working with all of you to make sure that happens. So I appreciate that very much. And with that, everybody stay well. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Jack.
Yep.